to this SALISES staff seminar, which sort of marks the formal launch of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, the University of the West Indies Honorary Fellow Program. I don't see him with us, but special welcome to Dr. Francis Severin, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal of the UWI Open Campus. I know Professor Winston Moore confirmed attendance, and he is the Deputy Principal of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill Campus. SALISES directors, Professor Audrey Henry Lee, Professor Don Marshall, and Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, who will be joining us later. I'll also use the opportunity to acknowledge Dr. Kevin Williams, Chair of the SALISES Staff Seminar Series, other SALISES Research Fellows on all 3 campuses, Honorary Fellows at home and abroad. I believe I saw Dr. Kevin Riney. Welcome, other distinguished guests, students, friends of SALISES, and well-wishers, welcome. I am Dacia Leslie, Research Fellow at SALISES, and I have the distinct pleasure to guide you through the proceedings of this evening's program. Today's webinar will kickstart with opening remarks provided by Professor Don Marshall, Director of SALISES UWI Cave Hill Campus. This will be followed by a presentation by Professor Audrey Henry Lee, University Director of SALISES, to mark the long-awaited launch of the Honorary Fellow Program now in operation. Professor Henry Lee's presentation will segue into the seminar presentation by one of our honorary consultants, Dr. Felicia Gray, who will be presenting a paper on arbitration as a viable dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO. Her presentation will then be followed by a discussion led by Dr. Yves Remy. And that discussion will be geared down with a 10 to 15 minutes Q&A session, time allowing, before Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, Director of SALISES UWI St. Augustine, provides closing remarks. So without further ado, I now invite Professor Don Marshall to provide opening remarks. Professor Marshall, the platform is now yours.
Yes, good evening, and I hope I'm being transmitted clearly to all in the internet and who are joining us live. Welcome to this launch of the Honorary Fellow Program. It's another initiative and enrich the capacity for us to engage to different publics about key topics and key issues that affect the region. No doubt we will welcome, I'm sure Audrey would, we will welcome back our distinguished alumni, Felicia, Dr. Felicia Gray, and we welcome her back to share with us the benefit of her her expertise and her experience. I also want to take the opportunity to say to all of our SALISES family, friends, and those that tune in to the things that we do, to just take note that we have an upcoming, the upcoming 23rd annual SALISES conference entitled, the theme is Caribbean Lives, Disruptions and Resilience in this Post-COVID Moment. And that is running on the May 3rd, Tuesday, May 3rd, and Wednesday, May 4th. You would see soon in your inboxes and through our websites, you would see the registration link and the invitations to come join us, be part of that conference. We have over 45 different authors making contributions. We're excited to be able to put this on once again, a range of thematics that fall under the conference theme. But back to this honorary program, I'm happy to be a part of this because I do believe that there is a way in those that have emerged from out of our course of studies, whether it's in the social sciences, law, or humanity. When we have done well, that they go out into the world, they influence many developments, they need to have them come back, give, share with us and the university community. Not only their journeying, but the kinds of insights that they've gathered in different spaces. Today we have someone from the WTO, and we are happy to have this kind of program where we can not just have the traditional academics like Dacia, Audrey, myself, engaging you, but bring others in to share with us the benefit of their no doubt peerless policy advice, no doubt insights, no doubt their capacity to share with the pragmatics of what it means to operate, live, and treat to trying to make for a better world. So we need to hear more from them, and we are happy to be part of this initiative. I'm going to turn it back to Dacia, but I will come back. And today we're discussing Dr. Remy and those that we as SALISES do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Prof. Don Marshall, for kickstarting this evening's program. So coming to us now is University Director of SALISES, Professor Audrey Henry Lee, who will be telling us a little bit more about this Honorary Fellow Program. Prof. Henry Lee, the floor is now yours.
Okay, Professor Don Marshall, Director, Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISES, Kayville Campus, UWI, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, Acting Director, SALISES, St. Augustine Campus, Dr. Felicia Gray, Political Economist and Fulbright Scholar, our SALISES consultant, and our keynote speaker, Dr. Yves Remy, Director, MITP Coordinator, Shridath Ramphal Center for International Trade Law Policy and Services, the UWI, Dr. Dacia Leslie, our moderator and conceptualizer of the launch of the Honorary Program. Ladies and gentlemen, students, good evening. Before I speak about the program, and I actually have a little PowerPoint that I will project, I just want to tell you a little bit about Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at the UWI. I always use the opportunity to boast and to tell you more about what we do. We are a hidden gem. There are SALISES units on 3 of the landed campuses, St. Augustine, Kayville, and Mona. And our vision statement is as follows: to be an internationally renowned institution for graduate education and research-based solutions and development. Our mission statement is to influence academic, public, and policy debates by undertaking research and graduate teaching from a Caribbean perspective within a multidisciplinary small country and comparative context. SALISES is the #1 social science research institute in the Caribbean. We have several research clusters, and I'm sure Dr. Leslie will tell you about her shortly. These include sustainable rural agricultural development, crime prevention and offender management, economic development, migration and development, social policy, demography and development. We publish 2 journals, Social and Economic Studies and the Journal of Eastern Caribbean Studies, and both are available online. We at SALISES build capacity throughout the Caribbean region. We offer a Master's in Development Studies and a Master's in Development Statistics. And we have MPhil PhD programs with concentrations in social policy, governance and public policy, economic development policy. Our alumni are very distinguished and include Dr. Dacia Leslie, our moderator today, Dr. Carla Barnett, Secretary General, CARICOM, Deputy Principal, Professor Ian Boxell, I think he said he will join us shortly, of the Mona Campus, UWI, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness. We believe in constantly publicly engaging in critical development issues facing small island developing states. Every year we host several conferences and seminars, and Professor Marshall just told you about our 23rd annual conference next week, and we also have an annual Caribbean Child Research Conference. And I'm inviting you to visit our regional website at www.salisesregional.com to learn more about us. We are on all social media platforms, so please, I beg of you to join, follow us, and learn about what we are doing. So now we're going to come to the program that we are launching today, and I hope you can see my screen. And should be able to see it now. Yes, so what is this program? It's an international program. We have appointees who are members of academia, private and public sectors. They are experts in their fields, and they usually attach to one of the several SALISES regional research clusters that I mentioned earlier. And today we're going to hear from one of them. They're usually appointed for 2 years. We do not pay them, so we are very grateful that they are able to join us and support our research, our teaching, our supervision of our students. They prepare joint proposals with us, research proposals for commissioned research or grants. We exchange students and staff. Dacia has been a beneficiary of a staff exchange for Institute of Small Island States. We host joint seminars and conferences, and we ask them to participate in our SALISES seminars and conferences, and today is an example. So these are there are 3 categories. They are the honorary consultants. So we have somebody like Khadija Williams, who is a principal director, student support services, village initiatives in St. Anne in Jamaica. We have William Clark Oka, Dr. William Clark Oka, who is a president and principal New Century, New Compact in Canada. And we have our own keynote speaker today, Felicia Gray, who is a political economist, American foreign policy analyst. Then we have the second category, which is the honorary research fellows. And these are some examples: Dr. Warren Benfield, Dr. Timon Stewart, Dr. Nelson, and Luna Munaz Sentifani. Dr. is also, she's an expert so we have experts in different areas. I have something on my screen which prevents me from reading it properly. So we also have the honorary professors. These are usually appointed by University Appointments Committee. The others are appointed by campus appointments committees. And we have Professor Hamid Ghani, our former director of SALISES St. Augustine. We have Professor Melissa Leach, who is the Director of Institute of Development Studies in the UK, and Professor David Williams, who is Professor of Public Health, Harvard University. So they are from all spectrums of life. They give us a lot of support. We want to thank them. And in this mode, I officially launch the program, and I ask that you support our program, that if you are interested, you can get in contact with one of the coordinators of the research clusters. They are listed on our website, but follow us on all our social platforms, and you will hear more about the exciting work that is taking place at SALISES. Much work is being done, both in our teaching and research programs, and I thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you very much, Dr. Leslie. Over to you.
Thanks, Prof. Henry Lee, for that intervention. Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite you to turn your attention to the keynote presentation entitled Arbitration as a Viable Dispute Settlement Mechanism at the WTO. The presentation will, amongst other things, demonstrate the interdisciplinary nature of the research work we do here at SALISES and the range of experts we have supporting the realization of the FSS REACH strategic vision of realizing impact through research, exceeding the expectations of our stakeholders, actively advocating for inclusive, sustainable development, committed to being caring professionals, and harnessing our skills through continuous improvement and empowerment. Our presenter today, Dr. Felicia A. Gray, is a Fulbright scholar who did her PhD at the graduate program in International Studies at Old Dominion University in the US. She has an LLM in International Trade Law from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, and a Master's in International Relations from the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. She also holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in International Relations with a double minor in Spanish and Psychology from the UE. Dr. Gray is also the author of the book, States and Non-Participatory Memberships at the WTO, and is single author of several peer-reviewed articles which have featured in the Journal of International Dispute Settlement, the International Trade Journal, and Digest of Middle East Studies. Dr. Gray, thank you for accepting the invitation to share with us your insights from your growing body of research. I now invite you to make your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leslie, for that very warm introduction. Good evening to you, our chair for this evening's function. I also say a special good evening to our SALISES directors, Professor Henry Lee, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, and Professor Don Marshall. Good evening as well to Dr. Remy and the entire UE leadership team at the Shridath Ramphal Center for International Trade Law, Policy, and Services. To the SALISES team as well, who worked so hard to put on this seminar, as well as to all the members of our audience who have joined us this evening. A pleasant evening to you all. Before I do my presentation, I would firstly like to acknowledge Professor Henry Lee, whose passion, dedication, and drive are seen, among other things, in the stellar research work that SALISES does, and also its contribution to national development. Thank you so much, Professor Henry Lee, for your leadership, and also for the opportunity to participate in this evening's seminar. It is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. As Dr. Leslie mentioned, this evening I will be sharing on arbitration as a viable dispute settlement alternative at the WTO. And so you would have seen or heard of the World Trade Organization and some of the gridlock that has been happening there over the past year and a half, I think approaching 2 years. And so my presentation is centered a little bit around that and has some recommendations about how we might circumvent some of that in the interim. And so as I do my presentation, I will talk a little bit about the prevalence of litigation at the WTO, and then have some thoughts about the provisions that are available for arbitration. These are Article 21.3c, Article 22.6, and Article 25. And then I will close with some thoughts on Article 25, which allows for arbitration as an autonomous feature of the WTO. And so that's how I hope to close, along with, of course, some recommendations for what we might consider as members of the WTO as a way of moving forward. And so what is the WTO and why should we think about what's happening there, the crisis that we're currently seeing? So the World Trade Organization came into existence in January 1, 1995, replacing the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which to a large extent had power politics at play. It also had some deficiencies in that those who joined were contracting parties, whereas for the WTO, those who now join are members. And so there's a difference between being a member of an organization and being a contracting party. And what this organization does is that it seeks to regulate trade among countries. As of July 2016, there are 164 members. And in a world where we have about 191, 193 countries or thereabout, having 164 members in a single organization is a big deal. Because what this means is that the WTO regulates about 98% of world trade. The WTO, according to its mission, says that it aims for trade to flow as smoothly, freely, and predictably as possible. And so based on its different agreements, members sign on that they would adhere to the principles, rules, norms, and beliefs of the WTO system, the world trading system. Importantly, members also sign on to the agreement that in the event of a trade violation, in the event that it feels that a member has breached one of its rights under any one of the WTO agreements, these members pledge that they will not respond unilaterally, meaning they will not respond with protectionism, but instead they will seek institutional recourse as a means of settling that dispute. When members do this, the WTO is set up in a way that consultations is the first thing that takes place. And the WTO expects that with its good offices, conciliation, and mediation, these members should be able to come to an amicable settlement of this dispute. In the event, however, that these consultations do not result in settlement, then the aggrieved party can ask for a panel to be established to hear the dispute. When the panel hears the dispute, the panel will make its findings public. If the member feels that it doesn't agree with the findings of the panel, then it can indicate its intention to appeal. At least this was before November 2020 or thereabout. Its intention to appeal the panel report. And this panel report will go before an appellate body. So what happened? In December 2019, this appellate body basically came to a gridlock. And this gridlock was caused by the fact that the United States had been consistently blocking the reappointment of any new arbitrators. And you need a quorum of 3 arbitrators to work on a case at any one time. And so the term of these arbitrators were ending and the United States was blocking their reappointment. And it went until December when we had 1 arbitrator left, who ironically or coincidentally was the arbitrator from China. That member's term also ended. And so we now have no arbitrators in the WTO's appellate body. And this matters because the appellate body is the second stage of an adjudicatory process where members can say there might be some legal inconsistencies in how the panel came to its conclusion. And so we would like the appellate body to see if it could hear our case. And so with no appellate body in place, it means that countries might seek to appeal anyway, something we'll talk about a little bit later called appeal in the void. And so the whole dispute settlement process came to a standstill. And it came to a standstill until the European Union and several countries said, you know what? The WTO actually has a provision for arbitration. And this is Article 25. And under Article 25, members can evoke arbitration at any period of the dispute settlement process. And so they came up with this multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement pursuant to Article 25. And the aim is for those persons or those members that choose to join the MPIA in the event that there's an appeal of the panel report or there is any other part of the dispute settlement process that they would like the MPIA to look into, then this organization or this setup within the WTO would be available. Importantly, the MPIA is to be an interim initiative. It is supposed to exist only for as long as there's this impasse in the WTO's appellate body. And so before I talk about arbitration, because this is something that I think is of interest to scholars who follow the WTO, is that arbitration is kind of like a best kept secret in the WTO. It is something that works, but it's not something that is as regularly utilized as litigation. And so of keynote here is the fact that the United States is the country that has invoked the DSB the most. It is the most prevalent complainant when you look at how countries use the DSB. And so it's kind of ironic that the country that uses the institution the most should be the one that complains that, it's not working well. What are some of the problems the United States has? Well, the United States has complained of judicial overreach, saying that the appellate body has gone above and beyond what the WTO provisions allow it for, and that countries did not agree to this when they became members of the WTO. We should mention that the United States is one of the key founders of both the GATT and the WTO. So in a lot of ways, how the WTO functions is because of the arrangements that the United States put in place when the organization was coming into being. And so the United States has accused the appellate body of judicial overreach. It has also accused it of a lack of transparency, and also for it being outright unfair to American interests. And so this is one of the problems that the United States has. I hasten to add, however, that the United States is not the only country that has issues with the WTO. Several countries do, because there are structural weaknesses within the organization. The United States, however, has been the most vocal in terms of highlighting some of these issues and also outrightly blocking appellate body judges. In 1 year, the United States even blocked its own appellate body judge with a view of appointing somebody else whose thinking and practice would be more in line with what it believes its trade interests are. But just to say that when we look at the WTO and we see the top users, we see the United States, we see the EU, we see Canada, we see Brazil, we see Japan, we see Mexico, India, China, Argentina, and Korea. All of these countries are active litigants at the WTO. And so when you think about why these countries would be so active in their litigation interests, of course, trade matters. And so a part of it has to do with trade volumes, the volumes of trade that moves between and among these countries, and consequently, the interests that are at stake. Now, this does not mean that arbitration has no benefits at all. Indeed, some scholars would say that when compared with litigation, arbitration sometimes is a little bit more flexible. It's also cheaper. It's also a much quicker process, and it's more private. One catch to this is that the arbitration award is final. And so whereas for litigation, you can appeal the award, usually for arbitration, the members agree that we will accept the arbitration award. It's final. And so throughout the WTO, you would find that litigation is more prevalent than arbitration. When we look at some of the agreements that members usually bring to the fore or usually evoke when they bring forth a dispute, the GATT 1994 is the main instrument that members evoke when they have a dispute. And then because the WTO has duties that members can impose on one another in the event that they think their trade rights are being violated, I speak of, for example, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and safeguards. These agreements are usually some of the ones that are also more popularly used. And of course, agriculture, very important to developing countries and also to the EU and the United States. So most of the times when agreements are being used to support disputes that members have, as you can see projected, these are the agreements that usually come to the fore. So I mention litigation because in a lot of ways, litigation is much more public. And so in a sense, countries are socialized to use litigation and not to go for arbitration. And I'll mention this a little later about the politics of dispute settlement. Countries sometimes use dispute settlement to signal both to their domestic audiences and to international audiences as well that this is an issue that they care about. And so the publicity of litigation allows for a lot of signaling. It also allows for a lot of political cover. And because of that, countries are socialized to use litigation as their first resort for a dispute. But as you would have imagined, there are provisions within the WTO for arbitration. These are Article 21.3c, Article 22.6, and Article 25. So what is of note here is that Article 21.3c and 22.6 are not articles that can be used by themselves. They usually follow a panel or an appellate body report. And here, members would vote them if they are not satisfied with some part of what the panel had to say or either the appellate body. And I'll mention that in a second as I talk about each article. But to date, 38 cases have invoked Article 21.3c, while 25 have used 22.6. And before the EU and the group of countries came up with MPIA, only one case had used Article 25. And of note is, this one case did not use Article 25 as an independent arbitration procedure. It actually followed a panel process, and there were some issues with implementation, and so Article 25 was used in that particular case. And so my general point is Article 25 remains as an alternative, as something that states can use without going through the panel process to settle their disputes. And so a part of the problems we're having now with an appellate body not functioning is or can be attributed to members not considering a provision that is already available to them. So let's talk about the first provision that the WTO has, which is Article 21.3c. And basically, coming out of a panel or an appellate body's report, the DSB meets. And then the losing party has to say how it is going to implement the WTO's rulings and recommend the DSB's ruling and the recommendations, the dispute settlement body. And the expectation is that the losing party should do this immediately. And so the losing party should say how it is going to do so. There are, however, cases when the losing party might not be able to immediately implement the recommendations from the report. And so the losing party might need a reasonable period of time in order to do so. And as you can see, reasonable period of time is in quotation because reasonable period of time is something that has been subjected to a lot of debate, and jurisprudence on this also varies in terms of what members can do. So what arbitrators have done is that they have had discussions about the when and the what of implementation, and then some have taken into consideration the measures that the member needs to put into compliance, and because of that, they have made their recommendations. So the average amount of time that has been given for this reasonable period of time is about 11 months. But some cases that we have seen, we have Canada Pharmaceuticals, where the arbitrator said, you know what, based on the case, 6 months might be the reasonable period of time. We also have US 1916 Act, where the arbitrator said 10 months. And then EC Bananas, where 15 months and 1 week was the time given. And to date, this has been the longest period of time that has been given under the reasonable period of time. Arbitrators have varied in how they think about this. As I said, some have said, we might want to look at the time and not the technique, the when and the what of it. And also some have said, you know what, it might be the shortest period of time wherein it is possible for the member to bring its measures under compliance. And so here we see arbitration following litigation. And here the member loses at the DSB. The DSB says, you need to bring your measures into compliance. The member says, this is something that I am unable to do immediately, and so the reasonable period of time might be proposed. I must also mention that here, arbitration is not automatic, because what happens is that after the member loses, the member has the opportunity to propose to the DSB what the reasonable period of time might look like. If the DSB disagrees with what the member proposes, then the member and the complainant can negotiate on, what this reasonable period of time is. If both of them cannot agree, then this is when Article 21.3 provides that an arbitrator will come in and decide what this reasonable period of time might look like. So if we're trying to understand why arbitration might be underused, here we see that it is possible, not because the members may not prefer or even consider it, but if you have a member coming out of a DSB report where it loses, the member might just propose a time that the DSB agrees with. And so we wouldn't need to go to arbitration. Or the member might have negotiations with the complainant and both of them agree. And so again, no need to have arbitration. Arbitration here only comes in if both parties cannot agree. The DSB also did not agree with the proposed reasonable period of time, and so an arbitrator would be called in. We also have arbitration under Article 22.6. And here, this is also something that would follow from a panel proceeding. And so again, Article 21 stipulates, as the DSB does, that, if a member has been found to be in violation of any WTO rule, you're expected to bring your measures into compliance immediately. So here, what happens under Article 21 leading up to 22.6 is that the reasonable period of time might expire, and the complainant might go back to the DSB and say, you know what, the reasonable period of time has expired. I need DSB authorization to either ask for compensation or to suspend the obligations that I have been provided to this member under these particular covered agreements, or it might be agreements in another sector, or anything that might be equivalent to the extent to which the member has nullified or impaired the member's trading volumes. And so here, once there is the authorization to seek some type of suspension of the concessions that are available to the member that is in violation, the losing party might say, hold on, you know what? I think this punishment is kind of too high. And so we might need an arbitrator to help us work this out. And so under Article 22.6, the losing party might ask for an arbitrator, either to see if the suspension levels are equivalent to the level of violation, nullification or impairment that was done, or if the set of procedures that were used to determine this were followed. And so here, what the guilty party might do is it might ask for the original panel that worked on the case to say, let us see if you could help us to see if these are really equivalent. And in the event that the original panel is not available, then the Director General can appoint an arbitrator to look into this. So some cases that have been used to look at this, you'd see that huge trade volumes are at stake, looking at cases with the EU and the US, for example, with the large civil aircraft, and you would see millions of dollars are usually at stake. And what Article 22.6 shows is that for members to actually think about arbitration, usually different agreements are intertwined with each other, and it's a very time-consuming process, which means that, again, the trade volumes have to be very high, or are usually very high, and then it takes a lot of legal and technical expertise and also a lot of time to keep this case before the WTO to see if an arbitrator can finally say, this is what the suspension level will look like. And so if you were following the civil aircraft ruling, for example, you know that both the United States and the EU were given the go-ahead to impose these suspension levels. But when we look at the amount that the United States was given, it far supersedes that of the EU. So quite a lot of money is at stake where arbitration under Article 22.6 is concerned. And so the final provision that the WTO has is Article 25. And here, as you can see, Article 25 provides for expeditious arbitration. And this is what my main point is, that here we have an article where you do not have to go through the panel stage. You by yourself, along with the member that has its measures out of compliance with the WTO, can say, listen, we have a dispute. Instead of going to the panel, let's work this out through arbitration. And so Article 25 provides for this. However, under Article 25, it gives the members the allowance to say, we are going to define what issues we are going to bring to arbitration. Now, this does not mean, however, that all the rights and obligations that these members have elsewhere under the WTO are suddenly suspended. It does not mean that at all. And so these members, however, have to agree that this is what we're going to do. And so a member cannot force arbitration on another member. The parties have to agree what the issues are, and they also have to agree what procedures they will use under these arbitration proceedings. Of course, the WTO membership has to be notified about this arbitration. And whereas for the panel process, those who wish to become a third party, you have the third party rights that you can evoke. Under this provision, if you want to become a third party, meaning you have some type of interest in the issue, and this interest isn't necessarily an economic interest, but you have some type of interest in what is being arbitrated, then the parties that are in the procedure, they have to approve that you can become a third party. And as with all arbitrations, the parties from the onset must agree that you're going to accept the arbitral award. This is very key to any type of arbitration. And so you may wonder if it is that people often say, you know, the panel process can be cumbersome, it takes a lot of legal capacity, it is costly, you need to learn how to dispute and all the rest of it. And then you might dispute, and then the panel has a ruling and you don't agree with it, and you can go back and you can appeal, you can ask for an arbitrator. Why not arbitrate in the first place? Why was Article 25 rather, underutilized? As I mentioned, it was just one case, and it was a Copyright Act with the US that was brought before the DSB that invoked Article 25, this one case that used it. Why was it so underutilized? And in my mind, I think a part of it is, you know, we just spoke about the fact that, you know, the members have to decide for themselves what the issues will be. They have to decide for themselves what procedures they will follow. When you look at how litigation provisions are, you'll find that litigation is far more specific. If you look at the Anti-Dumping Act, for example, and how it delineates how you determine if dumping is done, who is the domestic producer, how do we determine what's a like product, what is significant, and so on. The language is far more specific. Certainly, there are ambiguities in these provisions, but when you compare the provision for arbitration, litigation tends to be more specific. I also mentioned that, you know, arbitration is really a private thing. And so litigation is more visible. And something to note about the WTO is that it is countries that are members, but it's usually commercial interests that push their countries to litigate. And so you might have the United States and Mexico in a case, but it might be Cemex in Mexico with some other cement company in the US that are really the ones that are in the trade war. And so because of that, countries need to show their domestic producers that they're doing something about their interests that are being affected. And so the litigation is more visible. And then you would see countries use the litigation for political leverage. So if you can think about sometimes when you have elections in the US and you have Make America Great Again, we're going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay for it, or we want to punish China. You see that there's a lot of political leverage that countries use litigation for. And then I mentioned this earlier, that if it is that arbitral awards are final, that really affects the extent to which you'd want to choose this. When under litigation, you can keep appealing and appealing. It kind of makes it very, difficult from the onset to choose arbitration. And of course, the thinking that countries are socialized to be functionally similar. And so, since countries are socialized to litigate, if you can think of, for example, of when China just joined the WTO, or it spent a number of years as a third party learning the process before it initiated its own dispute, then this might explain why, in some ways, Article 25 was underutilized. And so what has happened is that the appellate body, which should be the second part of the dispute settlement process, was in place because, members who are going through the panel process, you might appeal. And so we have several persons who are there, but the quorum is you really need 3. And so I mentioned that, we have the blockage, and so we no longer have any members of the appellate body judges who are available. But the appellate body is important because it is a body that is set up to uphold, modify, or reverse the findings of a panel. And so it's kind of like a check and balance on the panel itself. And so with this now in jeopardy, you wonder, what is the future of the WTO? So the EU and 15 other countries, looking at what had happened in the DSB with the US blocking the judges, and they said, you know what, let's have this interim thing. And so countries like China, Canada, Brazil, and Mexico have joined. And this is important because if you think about the trade volume and clout and even political leverage that you'd have in the EU as a bloc, then you think about China, which is the world's largest manufacturer and exporter. And then you think about a Canada and a Brazil and even Mexico. There is a lot of economic power in the MPA as it is, even though the United States has remained outside. And so far, we have about 4 cases. I think up to date, it might have moved to about 8 cases that have invoked this mechanism since it has been in place. But the members say, you know what, we're only doing this for as long as the impasse in the appellate body continues to exist. So the MPIA, what it does is it brings to the fore this agreement, this article rather, that was underutilized. And so those who are looking on at what has been going on in the WTO says, you know what, we might need to look at MPIA to say that, this might help us to think about the future of the WTO. So arbitration as a viable dispute settlement alternative in a lot of ways is linked to how MPIA will function. And so one of my projections is, or one of the scenarios we can think about is, well, what happens if MPIA will be regularly used? And if MPIA will be regularly used, then it will continue to be an avenue wherein members can have appeals to their panel reports heard or any other part of the dispute settlement process if they choose. And so this might help, again, considering the types of countries that are already in MPIA. So my thinking is that to the extent that MPIA is successful and is regularly used, then this would be something that shows a continuity for the WTO, at least until we can have the appellate body issue sorted out. Another thing we can think about, well, what happens if MPIA fails? And so my thinking is, if MPIA fails, and what we are seeing already is that we have some countries that have not joined MPIA, and what they're doing is they're doing what we call appeal in the void, meaning the panel rules, and they said, you know what, I don't agree with the panel report, I'm going to appeal. So there's no appellate body for them to appeal to, but they're appealing in the void. And this is serious because what it means and how the WTO functions is a member cannot be forced to bring its measures into compliance unless the panel or the appellate body report is adopted. So for as long as the appeal in the void continues, it means that the member who brought the complaint may continue to suffer because of the violations that are in place, unless of course it chooses to respond outside of the WTO by being protectionist or by imposing tariffs and so on. And so if MPIA doesn't work, it kind of means that the WTO's dispute settlement body might collapse because you bring the case, but at the end you say, you know what, I'm just going to appeal. So it's not adopted, so you can't punish me. So that might be something to think about if MPIA fails. And then another thing to think about is countries join the WTO because in addition to the benefits that they believe that they have for staying inside, you know, it's a cost benefit analysis. And so if you think the benefits inside far outweigh the exclusion costs of staying outside, then you're going to become a member. And a part of becoming a member is you want to be sure that in the event that there's a trade violation, you can evoke a dispute settlement body to hear your case. So if this thing is failing, members might say, you know what, I'm not going to do this. And we know that countries have alternatives. You know, there are different forums in which countries have their memberships. Countries are members of bilateral agreements. Some are members of free trade agreements. They have preferential trading agreements between and among themselves. And so the forum that you choose to litigate in usually might be because of the trade volume at stake, the judicial precedent that you want to set, or you want to use this for something else or for signaling, of course. And so if it is that you think the WTO is not working, let me settle this bilaterally, let me go to my free trade agreement and see if I can get some type of recourse there, then what will be the point of becoming a member of the WTO? And so avoiding dispute settlement altogether at the WTO is a possibility at this moment. And so as I think about, you know, how we might envisage the future of the WTO, in my mind, I think, you know, the dispute settlement process is a very important part of the WTO, but it's one part of the WTO. And even though we have, you know, this crisis as we speak, the United States, even though it continues to block members, it is still a member of the WTO. Even when the Trump administration was engaging in tit-for-tat strategies with China, it still continued to initiate complaints at the WTO. So it means that to a large extent, China also did the same thing. So members still continue to a large extent to conform to the principles, provisions, and rules of the WTO, even with a dysfunctional appellate body. And so the WTO still has a role to play, I believe. In world trade, we mentioned that it's 98% of world trade that the WTO regulates, but there are some weaknesses in the WTO that needs to be fixed. In my mind, with this impasse in the appellate body, I think more emphasis needs to be on Article 25, because even with MPIA says that you can invoke Article 25 for any part of the panel process. Article 25 allows for you to arbitrate without going through any panel proceeding at all. Arbitration by itself is a viable, autonomous dispute settlement alternative at the WTO. And so I think more members need to consider, you know, litigation certainly is attractive, but arbitration might be something that you might want to consider. And so one of the problems with the WTO is this idea of consensus. And how consensus works in the WTO, it means that at the time of the meeting, no member formally objects to whatever is being proposed. And so if no member formally objects to what is being proposed, then the WTO says we have consensus. And so for most issues, there is no real active voting. It's just that we have consensus because no member actively objects to whatever is being proposed. And so, as you might readily think, having 164 countries and having so many varied interests at stake, that consensus might be a tall order. And so the WTO might want to consider, let's have more active voting and either say we need a supermajority or a simple majority, or let's have an executive body that represents different groups of countries so we can manage the voting. Of course, some might push back at this to say if we do have this, then the WTO might end up functioning like the IMF and the World Bank, where there's a power differential and the country that contributes the most kind of have the most stock. Here at the WTO, at least in principle, each member has an equal vote, at least in principle. And so moving away from consensus might have the drawback, but that's something that the WTO might want to consider, more active voting. I think as we continue to look at the issues, that we might want to allow MPIA to function as a plurilateral agreement, which to a large extent it is, because only a set number of countries have signed on to it. And a plurilateral agreement is, we had some agreements that were initially negotiated in the Tokyo round, and then they came over in Uruguay, such as government procurement, for example, the agreement on aircrafts. And so we only have a few countries that are signatories to these agreements. And so I think having MPIA function like that, and then if the larger membership wants to become a part of it, then that might help. So, let it function kind of like a test run to see how countries might respond to it. But continue to work on the major concerns. So even though the United States has been, the most vocal in some of the issues, there are problems in how the WTO functions. If you think about the Doha agreement that collapsed, for example, where countries just couldn't agree on certain things. We have the TRIPS agreement, for example, where developing countries continue to suffer even though their indigenous knowledge is being taken away by pharmaceutical companies. And so there are problems. And so acknowledging that we have problems, maybe try to get an oversight body for the appellate body to see that it's really meeting what it set out to do, kind of encouraging these judges to settle matters within 90 days. Those are some of the things that I think, we might want to work on in the meantime. And then we have a new director general who was appointed, new deputy director generals. We have a deputy director general from China. We have one from the United States. We have one from Costa Rica. I believe these new players at the table, we have a new administration in the US, might give us an opportunity to have, different ideas of how we might come up to a better solution to fix some of these problems. And lastly, which is my central point, DSU Article 25 exists. So continue to promote it. It is a viable, autonomous dispute settlement mechanism. So these are the thoughts that I have. I will now hand back to Dr. Leslie, who I believe at the appropriate time will accommodate your questions. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard from Dr. Felicia Gray, political economist and Fulbright scholar. Thank you so much, Dr. Gray, for sharing with us such rich insights on arbitration as a viable dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO. Please allow me to acknowledge the presence of Professor Neville Duncan, former director of SALISES, and Ambassador Dr. Richard Bernal, professor in practice here at SALISES. At this time, I'm going to just invite you to turn your attention to Dr. Yves Remy, who will open up the discussion on arbitration as a viable dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO. This round of discussion will be followed by 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. But before I hand over to Dr. Remy, allow me to just tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Remy is director of the Shridath Ramphal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy and Services at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, Barbados. In addition to her outreach and research activities on issues of international trade relevant to the Caribbean region, she teaches trade law and regional integration in the SRC's flagship Masters in International Trade Policy program. Her doctoral thesis focused on the role of the Caribbean Court of Justice in promoting Caribbean regional integration. She's also the WTO chair for Barbados University of the West Indies. Dr. Remy holds a PhD in international law from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, Geneva, Switzerland, and she has an element in commercial and international law from the University of Cambridge, and an LLB from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus, Barbados. Prior to joining the SRC, Dr. Remy worked for 5 years as a senior trade associate at offices of Sidley Austin LLP in Geneva and Washington, DC, and as a legal officer at the appellate body secretariat of the WTO, where she assisted members of the appellate body in their disposition of appeals in trade disputes. In sum, we know that we're in good hands. Dr. Remy, thank you for accepting our invitation at short notice. I now invite you to broaden the foregoing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leslie, and thank you to SALISES for this invitation. It's a treat to be here and to hear of the wonderful things our sister organization SALISES is doing cross-campus wide, but also in terms of the cross-disciplinary nature of the work. And I think it gives a lot of food for thought for the ways in which we can combine efforts, because at the SRC, of course, our major sort of driver is looking at trade. My background and those of some of my colleagues sort of influence the way we look at the issues. So I'm a lawyer, legal background, so I look at it internationally. But certainly some of the things that SALISES is doing inspires me to think more broadly about how we can reach out and do more of these fora. This is something that we at the SRC are planning to do. And so gives a great sort of blueprint. And the honorary program is something that I think we can replicate. So thank you so much for the invitation, and well done to you and the team at SALISES. This topic is dear to me for a number of reasons. As my bio indicates, my background is actually in trade and litigation at the WTO. And I actually was part of the law firm Sidley Austin that crafted an initial thinking about using Article 25 as the vehicle for replicating the appeals process, because of, at the time in 2017, we saw down the road the intransigence of the United States in blocking the appeals and eventually grinding the entire process at the appellate body to a halt, which actually happened. Since coming back to the region, what I've tried to do with the SRC is think creatively about the Caribbean's approach to these issues, not just on the MPIA as a tool for overcoming the impasse, but also using dispute settlement in a way that ultimately brings more value to the system for small developing countries, and those that still occupy the peripheries of the debate. And so what Dr. Gray has done is really pivotally sort of set out the basics of the understanding the system, but also showing the nuances of her proposal. And what I want to add to what she has done quite excellently today is think about it from a Caribbean perspective, and then also try to highlight what are some of the systemic issues that arise out of the use of arbitration or the arbitration system in order to block the impasse, and how we can see beyond just the current problems that the United States has raised and retake the issue so that reform doesn't pass us by in the region. So some of what I'm going to say is going to actually point to a way forward that the Caribbean can take. And I invite Dr. Gray, maybe in a second part of this paper, for us to work collaboratively on some of that and some of these thoughts, so that we can think about it from the Caribbean perspective. So what I propose to do in the next 5 to 10 minutes, I always go over my time so you can interrupt me, is look first of all at this species of arbitration that Dr. Gray, the 3 sort of different models of arbitration that Dr. Gray looked at in her presentation, which I'm going to argue has kind of muddied the waters a little bit between thinking about these in purest terms, litigation and arbitration. In my thesis, I actually think that both of these things under the WTO, which is a very separate, a very distinct sort of mechanism, it's actually neither arbitration or litigation in its purest form. And any of the options we undertake, whether it's part of 21.3, 22.6, or now the MPIA under the 25, it will fuse different elements of litigation and arbitration in a sui generis kind of approach. And then I really want to look at some of the concerns about Article 25 as a sort of a harbinger of hope, and bring in the Caribbean's profile, and whether arbitration really addresses some of our entrenched issues with WTO dispute settlement, and how we can bring our agenda on to any reform, whether it's through arbitration or elsewhere. And then just finally, just raise, because that's my role of as discussant, raise some broader issues for the audience's consideration. So just very briefly, I want to start definitionally. I think Dr. Gray laid out, in its essence, arbitration reveals itself in a number of different iterations at the WTO. And in its purest form, arbitration is an often used dispute settlement process employed as an alternative to litigation because of a number of perceived advantages. So notable is that it really brings control back to the parties. In litigation and judicial processes, really you have preset procedures, and most importantly, you have a judicial body that's usually permanent. Dr. Gray also mentioned, obviously, that you have appeal processes outside of arbitration. You usually have these in judicial, especially more sophisticated judicial systems. That's not really something you have usually and typically in arbitration. And what the advantages of arbitration, obviously, is that you can really select bespoke expertise that you want. And so you have arbitration in its purest form, really in commercial arbitration, also in the context of investor-state arbitration. And the highlight of these features, the highlight features is that it really gives the parties more control. Now, when we look at the WTO system again, I said my thesis is that arbitration never really exists in its purest form. Dr. Gray was very clear in saying, and I agree with her, that arbitration under Articles 21 and 22.6 really are embedded processes that are part of a litigious process using a panel, consultations panel, and then ultimately the appellate body. And so it's not seen, I think, as a complete alternative. And even within there, arbitrations are less sort of in the hands of the parties. So it's much more prescribed processes. And so limited control in kind of setting out the way ultimately the decisions are taken. And that is, as I said, one of the things about arbitration at the WTO. It's not really in its purest form. On the other hand, also on the panel side, so the litigation side that the Dr. Gray was mentioning, which is the alternative, even there you have not so much a judicial system. In fact, appellate board, the WTO members do not call the appellate body and panels courts or tribunals, because it's really supposed to still be member-based. So for instance, we have panels that are not permanently set up. We don't have rosters of panelists generally, and it's actually a function of the choice of the parties and the Director General ultimately breaking an impasse if the parties cannot agree. So neither of these is actually kind of really existing in a pure sense at the WTO. I think the only real option for true arbitration in the system is what Dr. Gray described under Article 25. That provides the ability for the parties to define the scope of the dispute, to choose the panelists themselves, and ultimately to kind of prescribe the procedures that they want. And so it is set up there as a counterbalance to the other, panel appellate body sort of process, but it's now begun to muddy the waters again because of the MPIA, this newfangled approach to replicating, again, the appellate process of the WTO. So even as it's being considered now, it's still kind of merging elements of the previous or the existing litigious judicial means into what was traditionally seen as an alternative arbitration process. So muddying of these waters. The second thing that I wanted, so that is something that I think is interesting to reflect on. The second thing is, what is the potential for arbitration to meet the needs and correct the deficiencies of the system as it has evolved? I think Dr. Gray was really comprehensive in setting out how arbitration using the MPIA has been hijacked, in a sense, by the US's concerns. So the US has brought the system to a grinding halt. And so what the concern has been is, how do we get the United States back to the negotiating table? And I think the MPIA is seen as an alternative in the short term, it's interim, but it is, I think, the way that has, even in the way it has been drafted, it does seek to address many of the United States concerns. And what are these concerns? Dr. Gray mentioned it's overreach. It's this sense by the United States, which is the biggest user, that it has been overtaken by these judges who are not elected and who ultimately go ahead, they gap fill where there are constructive ambiguities in the language of the treaty. They go ahead and they make decisions. They go beyond the 90 days for the appeal process. They don't follow, they feel like that they need to follow precedent, which is a big no-no for the US. The US doesn't think international tribunals should approximate the way domestic tribunals work. They should actually just decide the case before them. This big idea of many WTO users, including those from the Caribbean, that believe in the rule of law, that quite apart from settling the disputes, one of the functions of a judiciary is to create consistency through the following of precedent. That's not something the United States wants. The United States also doesn't appreciate the undue deference that the appellate body places, or the lack of deference, excuse me, to facts found by trade remedy investigative tribunals at the domestic level, but also fact-finding by panels, because there is supposed to be a division of responsibilities that the appellate body really doesn't look into the facts. But in many of the cases, the factual predicates and the factual decisions of the panels have been overturned through what we call an Article 11 process. And so all of these things, they pre-existed the Trump administration, but they were ramped up in the last couple of years, beginning really in 2018, 2019. So it ground to a halt. MPIA was used, as I mentioned, we thought about it first, not as extreme as that, just as a stopgap measure to kind of replicate an appeal process, because we had no more, or we were seeing down the road that there would be no more appeals that could be filed. Now, what does that MPIA look like? So basically, it's this agreement that takes the features of Article 25, which is just a very basic canvas, and it inputs all of the procedures from the provisions of the WTO text that deals with appeals into that vessel. And some of the things that it has changed from the original, as I said, as a sort of a nod to make the United States come on board, is one of the things is it provides that the supporting staff, the secretariat, which the United States thinks has too much influence over the outcome of disputes, that they are not supposed to overreach. They're not supposed to provide advice beyond what the arbitrators themselves want. It also says that these procedures should be streamlined so that they actually are done within the 90 days. The appellate body had been taking 90 days and completely eviscerating that requirement and going on and settling disputes over years sometimes for the larger disputes. So again, the United States, through its member control tendencies, wants to limit how long these disputes actually take. And other things like giving the arbitrators the opportunity to dismiss factual appeals. As I mentioned earlier, instead of having the appellate body disrupt factual findings, it actually would say that the arbitrators could not do so. And another feature would be, remember I said arbitration really allows you to pick your own experts, your own arbitrators. Well, in order for there to be consistency, what does the MPIA do? Well, it takes again the vessel of Article 25, and it brings in again this system called a roster system, where 10 appellate body or 10 judges are now among the list of judges that can be chosen. So it's very much like an appeal system. So yes, arbitration in theory could exist, but because it's now been sort of retrofitted with a set of roster of appellate body members or arbitrators, and a lot of the procedures, so the timeline for when the appeals have to be completed and all of these things, it's very much like the old system. What have we seen so far? Well, we've seen that a lot of the frequent users that Dr. Gray highlighted are under the MPIA. They've agreed voluntarily to be subjected to that fake appeal procedure during the pendency of the blockage by the United States. But importantly, we don't have the United States, but not just the United States. We don't have South Africa. We don't have India. South Africa and India have been very, very wary of the plurilateral approaches. As Dr. Gray mentioned, this idea that you have only a subset of members. Why? Because it will do damage to multilateralism if you only have some in and not others in. And importantly for our region, none of the Caribbean countries are party to this MPIA. Now you may ask why. And just for 1 minute, I just want to explain what the profile of use by the Caribbean countries has been so far. When you look at a table that we've done some work in this area, there's been 35 incidents of the Caribbean members being part of any dispute under the normal procedures, the litigious procedures. But in say for 3 of these cases, they've all been as third parties. So not main complainants or respondents. They really just come in and they have restricted rights, and they're not the main parties to the dispute. We know that Antigua and Barbuda was a complainant in the gambling case. And in 2 cases that never went beyond very basic consultations, Shridath and Tobago was a defendant. Why don't we see more Caribbean countries involved in dispute settlement? And will arbitration provide the avenue for them to rethink? Unfortunately, I do not think so. I do not think so because I don't think the systemic issues that still militate against them joining have been addressed. And what are these? Resource constraints. I hate to say it, but it's a fact. Resource constraints means that we have a limited ability to follow dispute settlement at the WTO. We also fear that we don't have enough lawyers. We don't have enough. Well, I would say we have lawyers. We have Dr. Gray. I would put myself forward as a litigation expert, but we certainly don't have the manpower now to really mount these cases and bring these cases from consultations all the way up the system. And even if arbitration were simpler, you cannot avoid the fact of inequality of arms. Right now, you have cases, the last case that I was involved in when I was at the WTO, and Billy Miller was actually one of the panelists on that case. You have thousands of exhibits, you have very complicated issues. So you cannot really come there if you're not armed with the requisite ability to fight your case. Will that be solved in an arbitration? Not really. It's an intrinsic feature. You need to get into the system and simplify the process so that all can actually participate equally. Another concern I have is that Caribbean countries right now are very barely represented in the judiciary. The appellate body, we've never had an appellate body member. Mauritius has had one, but the Caribbean has not. We do have profiles of persons serving as panelists. I've served as a panelist. I mentioned Billy Miller has. So these are the persons who settle the dispute at the first level, the first tier. We have Jamaicans, we have Kathy Ann Brown, we have Andrea Brown from the Anti-Dumping Commission. She's also served. But in the current MPIA, if you only have 10 members of existing parties, which, as I mentioned, are really New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Brazil, the European Union, the 10 members that have been selected under the MPIA, none of them are from small countries. So you just have a replication of the problems we've had in the past. And the main problem for the Caribbean is retaliation. So the system at the WTO is really built on this premise that failing compliance with the decision of the panel in the appellate body, the member that is aggrieved would be able to do what we call retaliate, and that is basically nullify and impair any of the benefits that otherwise would have been received up to the level of the impaired trade. If you are a small country and ultimately you have very limited trade with a big country like the United States, as happened in gambling, your ability to utilize that feature of retaliation is greatly circumscribed. That's the problem with the current system, is why would we bring a case against a big country if ultimately the basic arm that would give us what we want and force the other side to comply is rendered toothless. And this is the problem inherent in the way the system actually is built. So my concern, and I could say so much more, and I'll stop here, is that I think arbitration needs to be apprised on its own. I do think that we need to start considering not just arbitration, but the other ADR features like mediation and good faith, that these can be combined with arbitration as a last-ditch effort, and we can retrofit the solution as we see fit. But as conceived under the MPIA, I'm not sure that utilizing that is going to solve problems, because it creates new problems and it doesn't get at the problems that the Caribbean faces. So I'm going to stop here and throw it out there and be happy to address any questions that might arise from the audience. Thank you.
Such a rich exchange. Sound like we could start an entire series on this topic, Dr. Remy. Thank you so much for opening the discussion with a sort of insider-outsider perspective. I'm sort of conscious of the time, so I'm going to move quickly towards opening the floor for questions and answers. Just a gentle reminder for viewers, you can use the Zoom Q&A feature located at the bottom of the screen to make comments or ask or presenter or discuss on questions. But just before I go to the first question, I can see in the chat, Ambassador Dr. Richard Bernal, your hand has been up for some time, sir. So I'm going to now invite you to unmute your mic to weigh in on the conversation. Ambassador Bernal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello? Am I being? Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to make a brief comment. First of all, the lecture was by Dr. Gray was excellent, comprehensive, and lucid. And the second lecture added a great deal of value from Dr. Remy. Two comments. One is I want to go a little bit more away from the legal options within the dispute settlement process to talk about the practicality of small developing countries using it. And I base this on my experience in the US-EU banana dispute. First of all, these countries lack the technical capacity, both in the private legal practice and in the attorneys general's department, which are usually generalists and not trade specialists. The answer, of course, is to create a regional capacity, because we do have trained Caribbean people. And that is what I did when I was Director General of the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery. And one of the legal people we recruited was Dr. Remy. So we need to build this regional capacity. Secondly, without the capacity, and what happened in the past is that the firms that were interested, often foreign firms, and this happened both in the banana dispute and in the gaming dispute between the US and Antigua, was that the companies paid their attorneys to do the legal work. And that raises the question of whether the compatibility of interest was complete. Thirdly, the cost of legal work. Winban had a set of lawyers in Washington, and their entire reserve fund was used up in 2 months. It was so expensive. So hiring legal specialists difficult. Fourth, I have said many times to the WTO, in particular Pascal Lamy, the WTO needs to build a capacity to provide technical assistance, both technical and financial. And fifth and final, for small developing countries, a victory in the dispute settlement process can be a Pyrrhic victory. Antigua won in the gaming dispute, but they had no capacity to enforce compensation from the US. My second comment is simply that consensus invaluable for small developing countries. I just relate one anecdotal thing. In the Hong Kong ministerial, in the development plenary, there was an issue that Cuba and Ghana objected to. And the chair said, we cannot allow 2 countries to hold back over 100 countries. I'm declaring this to be a consensus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that intervention. I'll now allow our panelists, Dr. Gray and Dr. Remy, to respond to Ambassador Richard Bernal's many comments.
Dr. Gray, I'll let you go first. It's your forum.
Wow. So much richness in what Ambassador Bernal has just said, you know, and I really agree with the points that he has expressed in that when you look at the literature, legal capacity, technical expertise, costliness, these are the factors that are most highlighted that inhibit developing country participation in the WTO. And so Dr. Remy pointed out, for example, that outside of Antigua and Barbuda that brought this one case, Trinidad and Tobago that was sued twice by Costa Rica, one for pasta and the other for macaroni and spaghetti anti-dumping duties on those items, which they have been in consultation since 1999 and 2000. The Caribbean has largely remained inactive in terms of our own participation in the DSB as active litigants, either complaining or responding to disputes. And so I think there is definitely room for us to consider how we might build this legal capacity. And I think, you know, the points that Ambassador Bernal made about, you know, the work that has been done in the CRNM and so on, those are definitely places that we can look. One of the things that I have been looking at in my research is how the Advisory Center on WTO law could be one of those places that help us also to build capacity if we could consider that. And I have been thinking about it because it provides training, specialized training for developing countries at reduced costs and so on. And I have been looking at the Central American countries like Guatemala, Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador. These countries, if you look like at, for example, Guatemala, when it was first sued by Mexico over in its cement dispute, it had no real experience at the DSB. But Guatemala responded to the dispute, it joined the ACLL, and now I think Guatemala has initiated about 10 cases. And so the Central American countries seem to be far more active than our Caribbean counterparts. And one of the reasons I am thinking about at this point, a part of it has to do with your own trading partners and the types of goods that they trade. But I also think membership in the ACWL could be something that as CARICOM countries we could consider. We have Bahamas, for example, that is still to become a member of the WTO. And so where we are varied along the spectrum in terms of our own membership and participation. And so that is something that I think we could probably consider as a capacity building initiative.
I'm sharing in the chat some work that my students in the context of something called Trade Lab did on Caribbean and CARICOM's profile and where we should be positioning ourselves on reform. And I would invite, as part of something called Trade Lab that we run out of K-Ville, the law faculty and my center. And so a lot of these things are discussed there. I am not as, let me think about it. I don't feel as helpless as I think is being represented in the chat, for instance. I don't feel helpless at all. I think there are many things at our disposal that don't require a whole lot of money. One is writing, advocating, researching. These things are free. There is a lot of opportunity to present our views in the fora, in academic conference fora, which is where I try to get and ventilate the Caribbean's concerns. So that's the first thing, and coming up with proposals that actually, and understanding how to navigate it are a first step. I take the point of, and I definitely agree to membership of the ACWL. It's something that's recommended in that paper. I think it's something that is possible if we do it as a CARICOM entity instead of trying to meet the $50,000 that each of us individually would have to go through. They don't provide currently for regional membership, but I think even if one CARICOM country went and the rest gave, you know, some of the fees to subscribe, it's something that we could definitely get the expertise, understand how litigation works inside out, because what the ACWL does, which is an advisory center, it's like a legal aid clinic, but they are second to none in terms of the quality of their representation. So we can engage big law firms, but Turkey, Brazil, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, all of these users have used the ACWL, and I don't think they're any the worse for it. So I believe there are ways of us overcoming some of our inbuilt problems. I do think, though, where Felicia, you and Dr. Gray, you and I can really help is coming up with the ways that the system can and must be redirected and reconstructed. And we have to be in the negotiations. We have to be sitting in the MPIA discussions. One of the issues with arbitration in the current incarnation of Article 25 is there's no provision for special and differential treatment. And I think that's why Caribbean countries and others are resistant to go that route, quite apart from the fact that one of our hugest benefactors and trade partners, the United States, is not there. And we don't know how they're going to react. So there's a little bit of tentativeness with that. But I think the more ingrained issues is, are we engaged in the discussion and thinking about it from our perspective and putting forward proposals that actually at the CARICOM level can stand on their own and rethink dispute settlement in our own image instead of being reactive. I do believe there is space there for us, notwithstanding all of the preponderant reasons why we have had issues in the past. So I'm on the let's do it. I may be naive, but I don't believe it's helpless, and I don't believe we don't stand a chance in this moment of reform when the new Director General is from Africa. So she also, Africa's own trend and profile with disputes is worse than ours when you think of the fact that they have 52 countries within it. It's only South Africa, less even Nigeria, that are participating in dispute settlement at the WTO. There is a problem with the majority of membership not utilizing it. Why is that? So that's just my little spiel on it. Thanks.
You can hear the passion, and that's how passionate we are here at the university, the top university in the Caribbean region when it comes on to research and finding ways to make our research findings seep into policy formulation and decision making. I think we have time for the 2 questions I'm seeing in the chat and an additional one. So that's 3 questions. And then I will hand the platform over to Godfrey St. Bernard, who will provide closing remarks. So the final 2 questions the question is, with the DSU non-functional, is the current situation similar to the non-binding arrangements for dispute settlement prior to the creation of the WTO? Can you clarify the nuances that are different? Excellent presentation. And the second question from Tamu. Dr. Remy, can you point to any specific trade issues that a CARICOM country could have taken to WTO DS, but for the constraints of human and financial resources? And the third and final question is, so does the gridlock in the appellate body mean that there is a real problem with the WTO, or is this just about politics? So those are our final questions. Over to you, panelists.
So to answer, I believe the first question about, you know, the DSU being non-functional and so on, what does that mean in terms of how the system was before and how it was now? So in my presentation, I mentioned that the appellate body stands as the second stage of an adjudicatory process in the dispute settlement body system. And this did not exist in the GATT years. And so having an appellate body is actually one of the pluses that came out of the Uruguay round of trade negotiations. And previously under the GATT, you know, a member could simply block something that it did not agree with, either because there were concerns about the legality of the issue. And so in the absence of a consensus, then the report would not be adopted. What the WTO tried to do as the appellate body was instituted was to try to have a more automatic adoption of the panel reports. And here it tried, instead of having consensus, to have what we call reverse consensus. So unless a member that objects could get all the other members of the DSB to also object, then the panel report would be adopted. So we should also mention that it's very possible for a dispute settlement to end at the panel stage, in that it is very well possible for the panel to make a ruling and both parties agree with the panel report. And so there's no need for an appellate body to do anything. The appellate body comes into play when the member or the members decide that there's something about the panel report that they would like to challenge. And so the appellate body is called on to either uphold, modify, or reverse the findings of the panel. And so as it is now, countries that are still invoking the DSB, it is possible for a panel to rule, and that's the end of it. We start to have problems when members decide that they're going to appeal in the void. So you don't agree with the finding of the panel, and in the absence of an appellate body, you decide that, you know, I am going to appeal anyway. You're not a member of the MPIA, and so, you know, you're just going to appeal anyway until an appellate body can come into play. And in that regard, because there is no appellate body, if the panel report has not been adopted, then there's no way for you to get recourse on that. I think Dr. Remy is preparing to also respond to that. So do I answer the other question, or do I wait until Dr. Remy has responded?
Dr. Remy? Would you like to weigh in on that first?
I'm going to be selective with my questions, and I'm going to give Dr. Gray full rein until she's done, and just end with a few observations.
Okay, no problem. Dr. Gray, you can go ahead.
All right, so the other question that I think may have been a general question that I could respond to is, is the WTO in crisis, or is this just about politics? I would say it is both of them. And so there are structural weaknesses in how the WTO functions. And I mentioned the issue of consensus, for example. There's no way you can say consensus is no member at the meeting formally objects to what we have to say, and so we have consensus on an issue. It's just not possible. And then if you think about group formation, when the WTO just started and you had a smaller number of members, then it would have been easier to work out some of these issues. But as the rounds continued to grow and the membership also grew, and as we saw with the failure of the Doha development round, when you have the large number of developing countries who recognize the collective bargaining power that they have, then it's going to get less and less likely for us to have consensus on any one issue. And so the WTO might need to reconsider how it does that. Another problem coming out of even Doha was this single package thing where nothing is agreed unless everything is agreed kind of treatment. And so the WTO might want to think about, how might we break down these things? So the Bali package, for example, where we were able to work out some of these things. Later in Nairobi, we were able to work out some of these other things as well. So taking these things as issue by issue, those might help with some of the structural weaknesses that we have in the WTO. Lastly, this is a matter of politics, and I'll refer to Robert Putnam's two-level games that he says, each negotiator is really playing two games. On one level, you're on the international stage interacting with your trading partners. On the next level, you're interacting with your domestic audience. And your win set is a combination of these two actors and what their preferences are. And so a country would say, I would really like to agree with this, but there's no way I'm going to get this approved at home. Agreements have to be ratified at home by governments. And so it is politics because governments have to answer to their domestic constituents that can vote them out of office. And so it's a nexus of politics and economics and even law that makes the WTO work. So those are my comments.
Dr. Leslie, I know you're stretched for time and you're gonna tell me keep it brief, so I will. On the question posed by Time Moon about, there are issues all around us. Part of a job of a really good and creative lawyer is to figure out what is blocking access to a market and how do I craft the case around it. One of the major issues that we are dealing with in the Caribbean is blacklisting. I've written a piece on how do you use WTO dispute settlement to highlight the discriminatory nature of what some of the countries and organizations are doing against the Caribbean. Loss of corresponding bank is another one. These are trade issues. Why? Because they affect our ability to transact in financial services. They discriminate. Some countries don't get the same treatment. We're discriminated against. Caribbean countries have made these advocacy positions clear in councils at the WTO. Strategic litigation will at least allow it to bring it to consultations, take it out of the purely political and bring it into the technical. The problem is backlash. I don't think the real problem we face is either a lack of technical expertise. We don't need to have huge law firms taking every part of the case. We have lawyers in the region that can identify the issues, and we can get creative on how we fund litigation. As Antigua did, that had a problem, I know, but the Dominican Republic has found creative ways also. So I think the problem is not just financial, it's also a problem with the political backlash that we fear. And we may think our lawyers, but also our government officials may think that amicable resolution may be the better route, but I don't necessarily think that it's really only about the financial issues. And then on the question of the gridlock, I couldn't agree more with Dr. Gray. I think it's a compendium of issues. The reason it is so important to the United States is why China, the rise of China. A lot of these trade remedies cases implicate the way the United States feels. Decisions that it makes on trade remedies are being overturned by the WTO appellate body. And so it's part of a broader issue. We have legacy issues I mentioned before, small countries have. We don't have the clout, we don't have the mouth, we don't have the size. So whilst we, for one or two issues that come around every 10 years can be cataclysmic to our industries, such as bananas, when we do need to bring a case, we need to make sure the system is operating and functioning for us. Even if we don't do it often, we don't have huge trade volumes, the system has to work for us when we need it.
All right, and there you have it, folks, a lesson in international relations and international political economy to the intersection of regional integration and sustainable development. Right, thank you so much, Dr. Gray and Dr. Remy, for such a rich discussion on arbitration as a viable dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO. Of course, the conversation continues, and we hope that coming out of this launch, we can certainly look forward to some strengthened research partnerships in the area. I am conscious of the time, so without further ado, I'm going to hand the platform over to Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard to provide closing remarks.
Good evening to all, and thank you very much, Chair, for handling such a wonderful session, which we just witnessed. I must say that as a population scientist and as a statistician, I was very much enlightened and at the same time stimulated by the presentation, first of all, by our keynote speaker, Dr. Felicia Gray, and also by the commentaries of Dr. Yves Remy. Both were very stimulating and coalesced well to really accomplish the aim of the webinar this evening. So my heartiest thanks to both women for their contribution to this session. I think also, as I listened, I tried to wrap my mind around the issues that were presented. And clearly it was a journey into the field of international relations, at least from my perspective. And as surmised by the chair toward the end, I made some notes and I really saw within that journey pertaining to the realms of international relations, I saw inside of their international law, international trade. And as social scientists, as social policy analysts, we speak a lot about equality and equity. And we are actually looking at, equality and equity from the standpoint of nations internationally, regionally, and intrinsically within nations themselves. But this was a webinar treating specifically with the issue of trade. And I have to admit that trade is not a subject that I speak about in my everyday travails. But I remembered as a secondary school student of economics, having to read about trade. And I mean, when we think about human populations and the well-being of human populations, we thrive on so many requirements to sustain life and limb. But unfortunately, the nations we come from, the spaces we operate within, we are not able to produce everything that we need. We have to depend on other regions, other nations to provide us with some of what we need in order to sustain life and limb, and in order to ensure that, you know, at the end of it all, we are meeting the well-being and the needs for well-being of our populations and individuals within our populations. So this is really about equity, first and foremost, within nations, but it's also about equity and about, you know, at the end of the day, serving, you know, the needs for equity, the need for equality across nations as well. And I think herein lies the issue that was presented today in terms of, you know, how that is really facilitated in keeping with international diplomatic agendas and international diplomatic agendas as coined within the context of the WTO and the whole process of arbitration within the WTO. So really and truly, as we listened today, we heard from Dr. Gray, you know, a justification for arbitration following litigation regarding matters of international trade among members of the WTO. And she discussed, you know, the essence of arbitration. Of course, looking specifically at, you know, Articles 21, if I'm not mistaken, at least if I can remember, she made reference to Article 21 and Article 25. She spoke about the challenges associated with Article 25. And of course, I learned a number of new acronyms and concepts that perhaps I never heard about in my life, reference to the MPIA. So I now know a bit about the MPIA. And of course, it's the fact that it appears to be one of the viable mechanisms, you know, to facilitate the arbitration process. And that came across, notwithstanding, of course, some challenges along the way, but there was some reference to the viability of the MPIA. She emphasized, of course, the virtues of arbitration and offered and proffered, so to speak, some recommendations for that were deemed worthy in keeping with all of the challenges associated with the process. And of course, Dr. Yves Remy came along and extended the discussion, looking at some broader issues, but in particular, fitting the discourse within the experience and the context of Caribbean societies. And I think, you know, as I said in the beginning, the both presentations really coalesced well to achieve the objectives of the day. So clearly what we have witnessed here today in this launch of the Honorary Fellows Program of SALISES is what SALISES is truly good at, right? And we are getting better at it by the hour. We have actually brought in colleagues and experts that go beyond sometimes the subject matter base of SALISES to extend the repertoire of, you know, contributions that we can make to support development issues and development trajectories and development requirements within our Caribbean region. And I think, you know, the presentation today really provoked in many ways, you know, the sensibilities that we can draw from so many multidisciplinary influences that constitute what we do here in SALISES. And I really thank, you know, Dr. Gray and by extension, Dr. Remy, who responded in many ways to what was presented by Dr. Gray to ensure that we had a really worthy celebration in terms of this launch of the Honorary Fellows Program. We in SALISES take scholarship, we in SALISES take research very seriously. And as Dr. Marshall intimated, Professor Marshall intimated when he first spoke, he spoke about, you know, a number of events that SALISES does. And Professor Audrey Henry Lee extended that in terms of, some of the other events that we actually do. We have, the Child Research Conference. Professor Marshall spoke about the upcoming SALISES conference that is going to be organized out of the Keyville campus branch of SALISES. Mona campus did it the year before, and St. Augustine campus will do it next year. So we have had an annual tradition of fostering and engaging researchers across the board in terms of all of the disciplinary persuasions that are impacted by and impact the social sciences. So we continue to do that within SALISES. And I think, this is just another celebration of how SALISES fellows can come to the fore and deliver the goods that really make SALISES, and by extension, the University of the West Indies, look really good. I also have to state that I have at this point to throw in a little plug for SALISES St. Augustine, because coming up on Monday next, we will actually be having a forum by one of our fellows, Dr. Priya Mohan, and she is going to be speaking at the forum. She is going to be speaking to the issue of natural disasters and climate shocks, building economic resilience in Caribbean SIDS. She is going to be she's going to be the first of a number of our fellows here in St. Augustine who will be presenting their research works on a monthly basis. So she is the first installment, and this is going to be held next Monday at 10 a.m. The link has already been sent out to many, and I'm sure when you go to SALISES website on the Mona campus, SALISES website on the St. Augustine campus, you can find all of the details about that presentation. And in St. Augustine, we have also been hosting a series of SALISES virtual forums, which really showcase issues of Caribbean development, sometimes in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, issues specific to Trinidad and Tobago. But nonetheless, we have embarked upon forums where we have at least 6 panelists, sometimes presenting on different issues, and lively discussion around those issues. And so far we have done 6, and we intend to have quite a few more on a monthly basis as the months go by. So this is to let you know that SALISES is restless, intellectually restless, in terms of, the amount of things we seek to do to appease the palate of all of those who are looking for active and useful research to inform the various concerns that they have. So I have said quite a bit about SALISES and about the presentation, and I'd like to close now by just simply saying thanks to a few persons. I'd like to thank, first of all, the administrative staff of SALISES, Mona, in particular, Ms. Samara Reynolds and Mr. Richard Leach, for their contribution to making this event a possibility. I want to thank those 2 officers and the rest of their administrative staff in SALISES Mona who supported the work that was done to make this possible today. I would certainly like to thank all of the persons in the virtual audience, and especially those who contributed by asking questions and making comments to really make the presentations today worthy contributions that they were. So I thank all of those virtual participants for their comments and their questions today. I also want to express my thanks to the chair lady, my colleague, Dr. Dacia Leslie, who managed the process excellently as she normally does. I I want to be like Dacia one day in terms of, having that capacity to manage process the way she has done today. So my thanks to you, my dear colleague Dacia, for the way she handled the session today. Thank you very much. Of course, I expressed my thanks to Dr. Gray and Dr. Remy for their contributions. Greatly appreciated. More power to the two of you. And of course, I cannot leave out our University Director, Professor Aldry Henry Lee, who has been a dynamo in terms of, moving us and making us do all the interesting things that we do here in SALISES. And I want to say my special thanks to her for all that she has done. I hope there aren't others who I ought to have thanked for today's proceedings, but just in case I forgot any, I want to thank all of those who I may have forgotten. But by and large, I think time is of the essence. It's now 8 o'clock by my clock here in TNT, and I want to bring this awesome proceeding to a close. Thank you all for making this evening the pleasant experience it was.